first movie, even with a budget more than twice the size of the first movie. For instance, the whole feel of the first movie, the grittiness, the way it followed Peter and Kevin's comic book run, the script, the director, all of this was missing from the second movie. The first movie did really well, so they wasted no time whatsoever in churning out this second movie, and maybe that was part of the problem because this movie was rushed. The visuals on the second film looked very clean and very colourful, but it didn't feel grounded in the real world like the first movie did. The costumes did not look as good as the first movie, they looked less real than the first movie, more colourful and more cartoon-like. Another problem with this movie was the violence. It had been extremely toned down a lot. In fact, all of the turtles had their weapons, but they never actually drew them. For instance, in a fight, they would rely now on kicks or punches. There was one scene where you saw Michelangelo fighting with a yo-yo, and you saw Donatello fighting with a foam toy. There was a scene where Raphael actually used his sai, but only to catch a pizza. And then after that scene, you very rarely saw him use them again. Actually, I would say that the size remained in his belt for more or less the rest of the movie. There was another scene that I can bring to mind where Leonardo actually used his swords, but not on an enemy. He actually used them to throw into the ceiling, and then he jumped up and he hung off the swords and kicked the enemies whilst he was hanging off the swords in the ceiling. It was just ridiculous that they weren't allowed to use the weapons. The movie's plot revolves around the ooze that created the Turtles. Oh, and the Shredder. Shredder is back now, and it would seem that he survived, and now he's hell-bent on mutating his own creatures to fight the Turtles. But if you were hoping to see Bebop and Rocksteady in this movie, you're going to be disappointed. This film takes place 1 year after the events of the first one. This always frustrated me due to the scene where we see Shredder's hand burst through the garbage on the dump, and we discover that he survived. So does this mean that the Shredder had always been lying in the dump for a whole year? I mean, we see that the Turtles are now living with April in a new apartment since her last one was burnt down. Now, are we meant to believe that the Shredder has just arrived back from the dump, but the Turtles have settled down and April settled down in this new apartment, so it's been a year, and he's survived all this time in the dump? Another thing is, I always told myself that Shredder's return must have been a flashback to the same night he fell, as the foot had all arrived to the fallback spot, and Tatsu, Shredder's second in command, was still pissed about the Shredder's death in the scene that we see in the movie, which is depicted as being straight after the events of number one, although it doesn't match up. The timelines don't add up. I mean, you've got the Turtles who have been living with April for a year after the events of the last movie, and then you've got the Shredder and the Foot Clan meeting up at the dump directly after the events of the last movie. It just didn't make sense to me. I just put it all down to bad writing. Now, Jim Henson's workshop did come back for this movie, but as I said before, I don't think the look of the Turtles was quite right. This could be due to Henson's death. I'm not sure if his presence would have made a difference or not, but as he died just before the release of the first movie, and this film was actually a tribute to him. Another thing that was a disappointment was the absence of Judith Hoag as April O'Neil. Judith played April in the first movie, but in this movie she's replaced by Paige Turco. Paige was fine. She was a good April, but it's just a shame not to see the original actors come back. Now, apparently Judith wasn't invited back due to conflicts on the first movie. She didn't agree with the amount of violence in the movie. Casey Jones didn't appear at all in this, and this was probably due to Casey Jones being such a violent character in the first movie, so it was probably deemed unsuitable for kids in this toned down version. The actor who actually played the Shredder in the first movie didn't return either. This never actually bothered me as a child because Shredder's behind a mask, so you never really notice that. But it is worth mentioning that the Super Shredder at the end of the film, where Shredder's mutated into this big hulking monster, was played by WWF wrestler Kevin Nash. And then we have the two mutated creatures, which were a wolf and a snapping turtle, who were named Toka and Raza. Now, as a kid, I was very disappointed that we weren't getting Bebop and Rocksteady, and I couldn't understand why. Why weren't we getting Bebop and Rocksteady? And apparently, it was due to Kevin and Peter refusing the characters to be placed in the movie. Apparently, they never liked the characters of Bebop and Rocksteady. They thought they were too goofy. So Toka and Raza were created, which is baffling because these two creations were also equally as goofy, if you ask me. The two characters did later show up in the 1987 series, computer games, Turtles Forever movie, the comic books, and the 2012 series. And all that we will be getting to later. We will be covering everything. This movie also saw the temporary departure of Corey Feldman, who did the voice of Donatello in the first movie. This was due to Corey being in rehab at the time, although he did return for Ninja Turtles 3. On this movie, we saw the inclusion of a new character named Keno, played by Ernie Reyes, who was actually a stuntman in the first movie and was given his own character to play. And I didn't realise this at the time, but Ernie Reyes has been in a few other movies that you may recognise. One that sticks out to me is the movie Red Sonja, starring Brigitte Nielsen and Arnold Schwarzenegger. Ernie actually played the spoiled young prince, and he also had a role in the movie Surf Ninjas. But at the time, when I was a kid and I used to love watching these films, I never made the connection. And it's interesting to see now when I watch them now on TV, I think, oh yeah, that's him. It's obvious it's him, but at the time I never really made the connection. This movie also features Vanilla Ice at the end of the movie when the turtles do a little dance routine whilst fighting. Apparently, one of the actors who played one of the turtles went over to give Vanilla Ice a hug in full costume because he was a big fan of Vanilla Ice and he wanted to just go over and just say hello and give him a hug for some reason. Unfortunately, he never got to give him a hug due to Vanilla Ice's bodyguards intervening, and they apparently shoved the actor, and then a small scuffle broke out on set. It's also worth mentioning that this movie was supposed to be part of a bigger story that would continue into the third film. Apparently, this second movie was supposed to be more alien in theme. There are rumours that the scientist in the movie was actually supposed to be Baxter Stockman originally, not Professor Perry, and it was also planned to have Stockman and Perry reveal that they were in fact an Utrom, which is an alien brain creature that would have resided in a stomach compartment of like a robotic body, which would have been the Professor or Baxter Stockman. And it's worth mentioning that these Utroms were a lot like the character Krang in the 1987 series, but they featured a lot more heavily in the comic book, and they were actually a race rather than just one character alone. And apparently this wasn't included into the film because they didn't want the kids to get confused with the Utroms and Krang, which is, if you ask me, why didn't they just do Krang? Early drafts of the script also had small robots that were called Mousers, and they were actually in the comic books as well, but this was also scrapped. So all of these new characters were supposed to tie into a third movie which would feature the Utroms and the Triceratons, which was a race of alien dinosaurs. They were probably abandoned due to time restraints and probably budget. The movie was rushed and made in just 1 year since the last, in fear that the franchise would fizzle out of popularity. And what I forgot to mention with the first movie was that Playmates produced no toys whatsoever for the release of the first movie because they believed that it was too violent and they refused to make action figures. However, that was not the case with this movie. Playmates made the figures that were different, better detailed, and instead of hard plastic, they were made from a kind of rubber material. Possibly another reason for the toned down violence of this movie was to purely sell more toys. We only needed to wait 2 more years and we would be treated with a third movie, and come on, it had to be better than this one, right? It had to be. In 1993, we got the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles 3 movie. In a nutshell, in this installment, we follow turtles who need to travel back in time to ancient Japan to save April, who was sent back in time after buying an ancient scepter at a flea market. In this movie, the turtles head back to feudal Japan in 1603 and find themselves in the middle of an ancient battle between a rebellion of villagers and the Lord Noriagi. Now, meanwhile, back in the present, we see the return of Casey Jones, who is played by Elias Cortez once again. He makes his return to the role, and Casey is there to look after Splinter due to the time travel rules. For every person who travels back to the past, they're replaced in the future. So the turtles were replaced by 4 honor guards. Elias also plays a character in the past. Meanwhile, back in ancient Japan, the turtles find April, who was being kept prisoner. They rescue her and flee back to the village, which is run by the rebels. We also see the introduction of Walker, an English weapons trader who wants to provide weapons to Lord Nobunaga for silver and silk, but then changes the cost to gold when he realises that the turtles are the ones fighting on the opposite side. The turtles have the task of defending the villagers whilst trying to make a replacement scepter so that they can get back to their own time, due to them losing theirs earlier on in the movie. This is probably regarded as the worst movie, although saying that, I can see where they have made an effort to bring us a better movie, but ultimately they failed. But before I tell you all the bad points, I'm going to try and concentrate on some of the good points. I'm going to try and be positive about this movie. First good point about this movie is that we actually see the turtles actually using the weapons in this one. Not a lot, but it's we actually see it more than in the second one. Another good thing about this movie is that Casey Jones is back, but he's back in a really toned down version of his previous self from the first movie, really toned down. Corey Feldman returns as the voice of Donatello, which I actually like. Sets and costumes, not the actual turtle costumes, mind you. The actual set costumes are actually quite good. Unfortunately, that is probably it for all the good things I can say about this movie. And now for the bad. First of all, the absence of Jim Henson's workshop is very, very noticeable. In this movie, a company called the All Effects Company took over from Jim Henson, and from the start you can tell the quality of these suits is without a doubt worse than any other that have come before in the Ninja Turtles 1 or Ninja Turtles 2. The bright colours just look off, they look shiny. They've got massive bulging eyes that roll around all over the place, and they look quite freaky. They've got huge distracting teeth. Splinter also looked considerably worse than in the previous movies. The story is pretty weak. It was loosely based off a 2-part comic story that was no doubt superior than this movie. Another negative is that this movie version didn't include any characters from the comic books or the cartoons. They just simply seem to create their own. Like I said before, Casey Jones is back, but you won't see him wear his hockey mask and crack some skulls. And in this, he is reduced to a glorified babysitter. Although we do see Alias Cortez play a different role in the past, it does not seem to be linked to Casey at all. Although saying that, there is a scene where April seems to recognise him and think it's Casey Jones for a split second. And I think there is also a scene where Raphael mentions that he looks like someone he knows, something like that. Like I said, I always presumed it was Casey Jones and he had some kind of ancient ancestor, and it would have been nice if they had maybe hinted to this or mentioned this, but they never did. They never mentioned this at all. Another issue is that most of the jokes feel forced and misplaced, and actually the same goes for the second movie. In fact, I think a lot of these jokes would have gone over children's heads, especially nowadays. I don't think any kid would understand most of these jokes. I mean, for example, I always remember as a kid there was a joke in the second movie on the scene where the turtles are stuck in the net when the Shredders captured them in the net and they're trying to get out, but the nets are proving too strong to get through, even though they've got the weapons in the belts. Once again, they could have cut through the weapons, but no, they chose not to get the weapons out. They couldn't get through the rope that was holding them. And Mikey says a line, and he says, "Remind me to drop a line to Ralph Nader." Now, as a kid, I never understood this joke, and even nowadays, when I've been thinking back to it and I'm thinking, well, I don't get that joke. So I Googled it. I didn't know the joke. I still didn't understand. I had to Google it. Now I realise that Ralph Nader is or was an advocate for safety, and Mikey was complimenting the net's quality due to them not being able to break the nets and get out of them. How is a kid supposed to get that joke, let alone an adult? You know, it's just ridiculous. What a ridiculous joke to put in a kid's film. And unfortunately, I'd say that's all there is for me to talk about the Ninja Turtles 3, and really, I don't really want to spend any more time on it. It was awful. What I will tell you is there were actual talks of a fourth movie to come after this third movie, but eventually it was canned pretty quickly after the failure of this film. But there are a few details that were floating around online that I can tell you about now. The next movie was going to be called The Next Mutation. If that sounds familiar to you, that's because they get a TV series a few years down the line called The Next Mutation, and we're going to be discussing that on the next episode. But in this movie that was originally planned called The Next Mutation, the concept was that the Turtles were going to go through a further mutation, including Splinter, turning them into bigger creatures, bigger mutants, and would give them different abilities. Donatello was going to gain telekinetic abilities, but as a result, he would have weaker eyesight, so he would have to wear goggles that helped him see. He also had a different bow that looked mechanical. Leo had a new ability to morph his skin into a chrome-like surface. Mikey would have the ability to project human features over his turtle appearance. And Raphael could morph into a raptor Raph, and he would hulk out and get sharp claws and sharp teeth. Splinter also would have had a similar ability where he could morph into a bigger rat mutant with massive claws and teeth and become like a hulking creature like Raphael. And there were also talks about introducing a fifth turtle named Kirby, after Jack Kirby, one of Peter and Kevin's heroes. And although this never happened, the fifth turtle would be introduced in a later project. Like I said, we'll be getting onto that later. And so this fourth Ninja Turtle movie never saw the light of day because of the failure of the third. But Ninja Turtle fans did not need to despair, or did they? Because you see, in a few more years, the 1987 series would come to an end, and then a little project in Japan, a 2-parter anime special of the 1987 cartoon, like a kind of continuation of the 1987 cartoon, but it was very, very strange with a lot of Japanese anime extras